The general rule of thumb is fans are the true agents of change in professional wrestling. They're the ones who buy the tickets, the pay-per-views, the merch. They're the ones who sit in the crowd and give you a real-time reaction to what they're seeing. In a perfect world, fans have all the power. You might even say,
"You are the authority."
I said in a perfect world. 2018 was a pretty bad year creatively for WWE. Long before Roman Reigns became a cool heel, he was an unlikable babyface in an endless feud with Brock Lesnar, finally winning the Universal title before his health problems intervened. He had some gag-worthy stuff like Bobby Lashley's sisters, the sacrifice of Asuka, Kevin Owens quitting and coming back with zero explanation, the Crown Jewel debacle of 2018 before the Crown Jewel debacle of 2019, the first Hell in a Cell match to end in a no contest, and of course, Baron Corbin, authority figure. God, just thinking about all that makes me wish I could have clicked my way through the last 2 years like that one Adam Sandler movie. Raw got so bad, the ratings were hitting all-time lows. Well, at least they were all-time lows for a bit. Things were finally so dire that on a December episode of Raw, WWE panicked and rolled out the entire McMahon family. The ones who could talk and who weren't currently part of the president's cabinet, that is. Standing in the ring, the McMahon-Helmsley regime admitted the company's performance had not been up to snuff lately. But they used some real creative license with this half-hearted apology, confessing that their TV product was crap while also blaming Baron Corbin for Raw's decline in almost the same breath. Think of how messed up that is. They booked Baron Corbin to be this totally unlikable guy who had the last laugh every week on Raw as the GM with almost no comeuppance. It was tedious. It was monotonous. It was frustrating. It's kind of like what the Authority did a few years earlier. The simple fact is, WWE is responsible for how every character is portrayed, from Baron Corbin to Roman Reigns and everyone in between. But according to the company, Corbin and Corbin alone was responsible for the show sucking so bad. They passed that buck as hard as a Hail Mary to the end zone in quadruple coverage. But before destroying Corbin on TV as some sort of symbolic make-good to the fans, the McMahons also made a lot of big promises.
In the coming weeks and months, you will be seeing new faces, new superstars, new matchups.
So roughly 2 years after WWE introduced their new era, the McMahons announced things were about to get even newier. To show how serious they were, it was announced that same night that the main roster was about to get some new blood in the form of a handful of expendable NXT mid-carders. Behold, Lacey Evans, Heavy Machinery, Nikki Cross, Lars Sullivan, and EC3, the chosen few deemed to be future stars, whose shoulders bore the burden of high hopes for the future of the company. They were the NXT 6, and this week we're doing a deep dive to see if they've been good as originally promised. The short answer is they haven't, but stick around for the whole fleshed out explanation. Let's begin with a brief overview of how everyone was doing on the yellow brand before moving on up. In her first year on TV, Lacey Evans took part in the first Mae Young Classic, losing to eventual winner Toni Storm in the second round. Boasting of her background in the U.S. Marine Corps, despite wearing naval-inspired gear a lot of the time for some reason, she received a handful of title opportunities and eventually turned heel in 2018 before her call-up. Tucker Knight and Otis Dozovich, better known as Heavy Machinery, were a fast-rising tag team in NXT. They got over in a very short time at Full Sail by leaning into the humor of Otis's Chris Farley-esque mannerisms with Tucker as the straight man. But because of that, they were never seen as credible contenders for the tag titles. But as I've often said here, who needs championships when you're popular? When Eric Young, Alexander Wolf, and Killian Dane of Sanity were called up to SmackDown in April of 2018, many fans were quick to object because Nikki Cross, the group's lone female and objectively the most interesting character of the bunch, was left behind on NXT. But after what became of those guys in the main roster, it's safe to say Nikki dodged a hell of a bullet. As a singles competitor with no group affiliation, Nikki wrestled in some great battles with Shayna Baszler and Bianca Belair. That same year, the mystery of who attacked Aleister Black was one of the biggest on NXT, and Cross turned out to be the key that solved the whole thing before settling things with Belair on her way out. Now, out of everyone in this group, EC3 probably belonged on NXT the least, in part because of what he accomplished beforehand. Derek Bateman was no stranger to WWE's developmental system, working in it for years as FCW morphed into NXT before his release in 2013. As Dixie Carter's kayfabe nephew, Ethan Carter III went through a career renaissance in Impact Wrestling, eventually becoming a Grand Champion and a two-time World Champion while there. After receiving his pink slip from the Feast or Fired briefcase, EC3 came back to NXT at the beginning of 2018. He debuted in the ladder match for the North American title at TakeOver New Orleans and had brief feuds with Lars Sullivan in the Undisputed Era, but injuries halted his momentum on the brand and even delayed a rumored main roster call-up much earlier. Of everyone in the NXT 6, his character probably had the least amount of airtime and seasoning before going on to the larger shows. Now, on the one hand, there's no requirement saying you have to be in NXT for 3 years and have challenged relentlessly for the main title before moving on to Raw or SmackDown, so it's not a huge deal. But on the other hand, Apollo Crews. After debuting for NXT under his real, much less scary name of Dylan Miley, Lars Sullivan soon became the host of beat on the yellow brand. Booked in a series of tag team matches where he'd take out his aggression on his partner afterward, Sullivan kept climbing upward with his chilling entrance and his brute strength. His run on NXT peaked in the spring of 2018, first as part of the aforementioned ladder match in New Orleans, and later challenging Aleister Black for the NXT title 2 months later, leading to his first pinfall loss on TV. It's too bad everyone's going to remember it for that whiffed black mass, though. A harbinger of things to come. As 2018 turned to 2019, Raw and SmackDown fans had come to learn more about these newcomers by watching the same exact promos for about 3 weeks that told you nothing of their actual motivations. And one by one, the NXT 6 began to pop up on the main roster. Nikki was the first one to debut on January 14th, teaming with Bayley and Natalya to take on the Riot Squad. That same episode also saw the arrival of Otis and Tucker, the former of the two making his indelible presence known on a moment of bliss.
I'm sorry, look.
Pretty ladies! Pretty ladies!
Tucker Knight goes to Vic.
Big man Lars Sullivan was also meant to make his first appearance on this show, but allegedly walked out after suffering an anxiety attack, which I truly sympathize for him. This unfortunate setback would be the first of several in his time in the company, which we'll get to soon enough. 1 week before the Royal Rumble, Lacey Evans made her first appearance on Raw, announcing she would debut in the Women's Rumble match. Not only did she draw number 1, she also lasted for nearly a half hour, which is nothing to sneeze at. Cross also made some moments for herself in the match, lasting less than 10 minutes, but getting quite an interaction with Billie Kay. And then there was EC3. Let's see how he was doing.
Samoa Joe, that's EC3!
Calls himself the top 1%.
Yes, folks, this is where you would find EC3 most weeks on the Red and Blue shows, quietly checking himself out in the mirror. Sometimes the mirror was big, other times it was small. But no matter what, that's what he'd be doing. Just look at he. Ain't he a sight to see? God, I wish he had Rob Conway's gimmick. At least he'd be doing something. Mr. 3's first actual TV match didn't take place until that February. As the mute guest of Moment of Bliss, EC3 was ogled by Alexa until Nia Jax interrupted in her pleasant, charming way. All leading up to Dean Ambrose joining the proceedings, then to a match between he and EC. And what happened next shocked just about everyone.
Knife cover as he floats over. He got it! EC3 has upset Ambrose!
In a huge upset, EC3 won his first main roster match with a surprise roll-up against the former WWE champion. With a moment like that, surely that means they got big things lined up for the guy. I just can't wait to see how everything unfolds. Let's circle back to Lacey Evans for a bit. Now, after the impressive showing in the Rumble, you'd think she'd be on the fast track to success in the company. Instead, she spent the next several weeks as a literal walk-on. There she was, doing a walk, doing a wave, then leaving. This is what they thought was a good way to build her up as a character. If that's all it takes, then any of the stuff behind me will make their debut as a side character any minute. Nice try, but you were already established.
Don't be a jabroni. The Rock says wash up so you don't get the roni.
Where the hell did you come from? Meanwhile, Nikki Cross was pretty much invisible after the Rumble match until she was finally drafted to Raw that May. And when she did show up, it wasn't exactly the Nikki most fans were used to.
I'm so happy for you. Oh my gosh,
what else was she did? So trying to like separate us and split us. Like, why was she even saying that stuff?
You were the first person to take me seriously.
It's my style and everything.
Do you like it?
Oh my God, thank you so much. How does it look? How does it look?
Suddenly, she dropped a lot of the wild mannerisms that made her so beloved in the first place. No more screaming or hair pulling or wild arm flailing. Over time, she was just calm and collected Nikki, who may or may not have been exploited by the heelish Alexa Bliss. At least she still dressed the same. Now, it's not uncommon for characters with crazy gimmicks to eventually mellow out. We've seen it with Mick Foley, Al Snow, R-Truth before he went crazy again. Even Gorilla Monsoon was a wild, savage beast in his heyday. But Nikki's transformation was instant. No gradual change or no explanation as to why she was suddenly so different. They couldn't even come up with a half-baked idea like changing her meds. It worked for Luke Gallows. As all that was going on with the ladies, Heavy Machinery spent the bulk of 2018 doing diddly dick besides blatantly copying the Bushwhackers gimmick, minus all the head licking. And we all know how well that stuff panned out for those guys. Oh yeah, good point. At least EC3 was keeping himself busy, on main event that is. The top 1%'s time on Raw was fleeting, and usually only as part of the gaggle of other abandoned toys chasing R-Truth for the 24/7 title, winning the belt 4 times in all, but never for more than a minute or so. The 24/7 Championship, where mid-card hope goes to die. While Lars Sullivan was getting ready for his second attempt at a debut, the online fans are becoming keenly aware of his pre-WWE days. It turns out a young Dylan Miley made the rounds on bodybuilding forums years earlier, dishing out racist, sexist, ableist, and homophobic takes like they were going out of style. Oh, how I wish. WWE seemed to know about the online activity, but also seemed to not care. Not only did Lars debut on the Raw after WrestleMania 35 go as planned, his first big feud on SmackDown was against the Lucha House Party. No sir, nothing wrong with the optics of a guy with a history of racist douchebaggery beating the crap out of a group of minorities. Lars would go on to issue a public apology for the comments made as a young adult, and in a bold-faced attempt to cover their asses and come off as caring, WWE announced they had fined Lars $100,000. What? $100,000? Holy shit, I'm not a fan of what the guy wrote, but $100 grand for being a prick online? That's pretty steep, don't you think? I mean, I'm pretty sure Lars hasn't even earned that much money yet, period. Not to mention, it sets a really weird precedent for the company on what they can punish their wrestlers for, and that's pretty unsettling on its own. How can Lars bounce back from this?
Would you ever ask a nightingale why they sing their sweet song? Then why would you ever ask what drives a man like me?
You know what? Let's just jump to the next headline. WrestleMania 35 saw the long-awaited coronation of Becky Lynch as one of the top stars in WWE, winning both women's titles in the main event. And what better post-Mania rival was there than an unproven newcomer who'd spent the bulk of her time on the main roster doing laps on the entrance ramp. For the next 4 months, the Raw women's title scene was defined by the Becky-Lacey rivalry, with a lot of outside help from Universal Champion Seth Rollins and the big old meanie who ruined Raw forever but who is still kept on for reasons, Baron Corbin. The storyline dragged for ages and helped absolutely nobody, least of all Lacey, who, shock of shocks, still needed some polish in the ring. In the end, it felt like neither woman gained much from it. Becky deserved a bit more variety in the first part of her run, and Lacey looked overexposed in her first real storyline on the main roster. Nikki Cross would fill in for Alexa Bliss in the 2019 Money in the Bank match, and after weeks of what seemed like a teased breakup, she and Alexa just ended up becoming a regular team and BFFs, and nobody questioned it anymore. For all my complaining about Nikki's sudden change in character, the team worked pretty well and became 2-time tag champs in the process, most recently at WrestleMania 36. As for what happened next, well, that's for the next chapter. Much like Lacey on Raw, our beefy blue-collar boys had a similarly lengthy chase for the tag titles on SmackDown, challenging Daniel Bryan and Eric Rowan. And like with Lacey, the team remained off and on contenders for the titles, always coming up short. Not every team is destined for championships, but as I mentioned earlier, they were a pretty popular pair, and Otis was over as hell. So over, in fact, he was about to take part in one of the more interesting storylines leading into one of the more interesting WrestleManias. At this point in the timeline, there's sadly not much new to report for the former Impact World Champ, still relegated to main event for months until he went out with a concussion in November of 2019. That is just depressing. I need something to lift my spirits after that. Lars, I'm begging you, what do you got for me? Some delicious irony there. Now let's round this off and bring everyone up to speed. Despite not making many waves in the title picture, Lacey Evans still had an indomitable presence on television in 2019, moving from Raw to SmackDown in the draft. Eventually, she got to make history of her own, as she and Natalya were the first women to wrestle a match in Saudi Arabia at Crown Jewel. Yes, the Saudi Arabia deal was a political hornet's nest and created a lot of controversy and ended up going to court, which led to a recent settlement, which nobody's talking about for some reason. But beyond all that, Evans and Natalya deserve major credit for that achievement on its own. In her last major act as a heel that year, Evans took part in the Women's Survivor Series match for SmackDown against Raw and NXT in a losing effort. By the beginning of 2020, Evans had turned face simply because she wasn't Bayley and challenged the champ for the title, but the babyface run didn't last very long as WWE moved into the pandemic era. As of press time, she's back on Raw and still a constant presence in the women's division, but has yet to break through as a champion. As the aforementioned pandemic drastically changed the presentation and the talent makeup of WWE, Nikki Cross and Alexa were temporarily cooled off as a team after losing the tag titles to Sasha Banks and Bayley in June of 2020. This allowed Cross to get more shine in the singles ranks, challenging Bayley for the SmackDown Women's title on more than one occasion to no success. But while Nikki was chasing championship gold, Alexa was suddenly caught in the crosshairs of The Fiend. In the last couple of months before this recording, Bliss has gone full cuckoo bonkersville as Bray's sadistic sidekick and has recently abandoned her former best friend. Kind of ironic since it was Nikki who started out as the crazy one. The end of 2019 brought about the beginning of a very wholesome angle on SmackDown, when Mandy Rose gifted Otis a lovely ham to make up for the one Cesaro had smashed 1 week earlier.
I love giving out gifts, especially ham, mouthful of joy.
But as the relationship got more adorable, except for that moment, cracks began to appear between Rose and her longtime partner Sonya Deville. A love triangle formed between Otis, Mandy, and Dolph Ziggler, and finally before WrestleMania, it was revealed that Sonya had been working with Dolph to keep Rose and Otis apart. The reveal came thanks to a well-timed intervention by the mysterious SmackDown hacker, a storyline that began with a lot of intrigue but then ended with retribution. So there's that. Otis's victory over Dolph at Mania, ending with a kiss from a rose, was a much-needed feel-good moment during a very strange time for the company. In fact, everything from the Christmas episode of SmackDown until this point was actually one of the better angles the company had been doing at the time. Now, just 2 weeks ago, I made a countdown of some of the biggest overachievers in wrestling, and the more I think about it, I really should have put this guy on the list as well. Things got even better for Otis as the year went on. Not only did he win the Girl at Mania, he won the Money in the Bank briefcase as part of this year's wild double match at WWE headquarters, with one of the most improbable endings in a long time. Yes, things were looking up for the big guy until he lost the briefcase to The Miz after his partner turned on him.
Oh my God, what the hell? Tucker just clocked his best friend with the briefcase.
Well, I was wondering what Tucky had been up to all this time, since whatever he was doing, it sure wasn't alongside Otis. At Hell in a Cell, Tucker stabbed Otis in the back to cost him the briefcase, then delivered the old cliche explanation of professional jealousy. Tucker has since proven himself to be the better half of the team by hardly showing up on TV while still being able to get a couple of blink-and-you-miss-it 24/7 title reigns in a terrible match on Raw. I mean, I know we're early into the breakup here, but it sure feels like it's been worth it. Meanwhile, Otis is still prominently featured on SmackDown, highlighted by his appearance in the Survivor Series match as the team's fifth man. Some fans argue that Big E should have received that spot, but it turns out there was a marketing purpose behind that, which is honestly just as cool and a lot easier on the joints. Besides, Otis did okay in that match, his actions leading to my pick for Call of the Night.
It's like watching a baby cow be dropped on somebody.
Sadly, EC3 never rebounded in WWE after being put on the shelf. He never returned to television after his injury and was finally released earlier this year along with dozens of others as part of budget cuts due to the pandemic. From the word go, EC3 never had the chance to live up to his potential in WWE. His run in NXT was very start and stop due to injury, but somehow they did even less with him when he was healthy on Raw, and I'll never understand why. Why was one of the best talkers in the scene suddenly a mute? What was the point of him beating Dean Ambrose early on if they weren't going to do anything with that? Was this all some sort of creative sacrifice due to his time and impact? It seemed like either malice or incompetence on the part of the company, and given their history, both options seem totally viable. Thanks for the run, EC3. This one's for you. And I'll take with me the memories to be my sunshine.
Right. Are you singing right now?
Yeah, sorry about that. Got a little carried away there.
Stop. I do not want your tears. I do not want your sympathy. Being released is the greatest thing that could have ever happened to me because that forced me to control my narrative. That brought me here to this moment, this hour, this day. Stop! You have been warned.
Sure, whatever you say, man. I'm just gonna go back to where I was sitting and just finish that review. So I'm going right there, so excuse me. But at least Lars Sullivan's back in the game. In October of this year, Sullivan came back to pretty much do what he did when he debuted the year before, beating up random people with glee. In the weeks that followed, we finally got to learn a bit more about Lars's personal history and how being a victim of childhood bullying led him down a dark path.
I've been bullied my entire life. The laughing stopped, but the screaming, that continued for hours. I bullied the bullies. And that was so much fun, man.
Well, it's an improvement from asking about why nightingales sing their sweet songs. So the lesson taught to us by Lars, folks, is that bullying is wrong. But if you can take your anger out on those bullies to eventually become a bully yourself, then you're on the fast track to WWE superstardom. And that's been the story so far for the NXT 6. So much hope, so much promise, so much hype. Well, not a ton of hype, but some hype. At the time I'm doing this video, we're only about 2 years into the experiment, and a lot could change with the 5 members of the group who are still with the company. But as of right now, it feels very much like a work in progress. Between the 2 ladies who were called up, Nikki Cross has been presented far better than Lacey Evans. I've always had a bone to pick over how much her character changed from what made her interesting in NXT. I appreciate when gimmicks evolve, but I appreciate it more when that evolution is earned and makes sense. That being said, she's won some gold and has been in far more prominent and compelling storylines than the sassy Southern Belle, which should account for something. As for the men, if you told me at the beginning of 2019 that frickin' Otis would be the breakout star of the group, I never would have believed you. But because of how badly they dropped the ball with EC3 and just how cursed Lars Sullivan's time has been since his call-up, the man has come through in a big way, contributing to some of the more entertaining moments in the last 2 years. Even though his time as the briefcase holder didn't mean anything, and his on-air relationship with Mandy Rose ended flat, you can't say Otis didn't have a great year overall. After a little less than 2 years since the announcement of their arrival, here's where I rank the NXT 6 on how they've all done so far in the company. Yeah, not the order I would have guessed in the beginning either. But what was so frustrating about those call-ups in the beginning was, as good as it was to see them put in this pedestal and touted as future stars, nobody was really asking for them. In that Faithful McMahon family promo, Triple H talked about how they were going to present new stars and new matchups, and while it's a great idea in theory, the problem with WWE in 2018 wasn't that there weren't enough fresh faces on the roster, it's they didn't know what to do with the roster they already had. In a world where so many of the wrestlers would either stay at home or hang out in catering or just work dark matches, the last thing Raw and Smackdown needed was a bunch of new wrestlers to pop up and take whatever limited airtime the more established talent was already fighting for, especially if there was no immediate plan for them. And almost 2 years later, the upper mid-card landscape in the company is virtually unchanged, and the ratings have only gotten worse since the whole "You Are the Authority" proclamation. It's almost like that announcement and the call-ups were for nothing. If we really were the Authority this whole time, I'd say it was an even bigger failure than the original Authority.
Oh yeah? You know something, Zane? I'm getting pretty tired of all the slander you've been throwing against me and the Authority all these years. If you got something to say, why don't you do one of those fancy little videos about it? You're so smart.
Okay.
Oh. Can't say I saw that one coming.